I did the wool skin makeup trend the other day, and I don't think my skin has actually recovered yet. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Hazel Jane, and we are back with another episode of Monsters, Myths, and Makeup, which, if you didn't know, is a series where we get to delve into the weird and wonderful world of monsters and myths, whilst I attempt to bring these stories to life through a makeup look inspired by the creatures behind the legends. Now, last week we looked at Pandora and some of the increasingly misogynistic tales from ancient Greek mythology. I had some really interesting, insights and comments from people, basically sort of their interpretations of the story, what they had been told growing up, the variations in it. It was so fascinating. It's one of the reasons why I actually love doing this series so much, is just interacting with other people to hear their versions of it and kind of getting into these discussions with everyone. So thank you so much to everyone who engaged with that video and got involved with it. It was so interesting. Now, this week's episode, we're moving away from ancient Greek mythology and we're moving a little bit more over to the east of the world, but specifically the Russian Far East. I wanted to look at something that was a little bit more obscure, a little bit less well known than a lot of Greek mythology and some of the other topics that I've covered, and I was really struggling on what I wanted to look at. But the idea that I had for this week's video actually came as a result of a book that I'm currently reading. The book is called Raising Loki by Elliot. It turned up a week ago. It's a memoir about the relationship between an abused raven who was taken to a place called Collab Falconry here in the UK, and the author Elliot, who worked at the falconry and basically took on the challenge of earning Loki's trust and eventually developing this incredible relationship. I will go into a little bit more about the book and where you can buy it if you wanted to read it yourselves. But before I get too sidetracked with that, let me go get myself prepped and ready, and then we can actually start with the look. So as always, grab a Red Bull, grab a Monster, grab a seat, and let's go. For those of you who are interested in the makeup side of things, I will leave a link to all the products that I used in the description box down below. As always as well, I will apologise in advance for any and all errors in pronunciation of words, names, places. A lot of my research goes back into very old history all over the world, and some of the words that I come across are really hard to say. I do try my best to get them right, but please feel free to correct me on how things actually should be pronounced in the comments down below if I do get any of them wrong. Now, we were talking about Raising Loki, which was the inspiration behind this week's video. It's the memoir of the author Elliot and his relationship with Loki the Raven. So after Loki was rehomed into Collab Falconry and Elliot took on the challenge of trying to help him and regain his trust, Loki's now actually become kind of a bit of a celebrity in his own right now. Across social media, he's got a huge following. People absolutely adore the videos of him. I believe he's worked on film and TV sets as well. And Elliot's been sharing Loki's journey for years, and obviously has now delved into the entire history of it in this book. Elliot's actually quite a close family friend of ours, and honestly, his relationship with Loki is kind of like magic. I'd say it's the closest thing I've seen to Disney princess animal bond kind of magic. And the whole story is just, it's insane. It's harrowing and quite gut-wrenching at times, but if you haven't seen anything of Loki before, honestly, go check out the videos. I will leave a link to all the socials in the description box below, as well as a link to the memoir if you wanted to have a look at the book, because, the videos of Loki just make my heart so happy. He's so, cheeky. Now, from reading this book and my sort of general appreciation for corvids, because they're fascinating and they're intelligent and they're beautiful and they are honestly some of my favourite animals. They do actually feature quite a lot in mythology from all over the world. I'd say probably one of the most well-known cases of ravens within mythology comes from Norse mythology, which is the two raven messengers that are associated with the god Odin, and of course Loki's namesake being the Trickster god from the same mythology. So I started looking into it and just sort of raven mythology in general. As usual, fell into a big old rabbit hole, or raven hole I guess, because I was originally looking into the Norse legends of the ravens, but I then found something that I'd never heard of before but became instantly fascinated with, which is the raven trickster god of the Russian Far East known as Kutkh. I think I pronounced that right. Now, before we dive into the mythology surrounding this mighty Russian raven, I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of like raven mythology and symbolism in general, because again, it's very, very fascinating. And I found quite a lot of interesting similarities to the research I did into black cats and like superstitions surrounding black cats back in October last year. So generally speaking, the mythology surrounding ravens in particular, but also things like crows, blackbirds, any other kind of like corvid or black bird, it usually leans more into like the bad omen side of things, often being to do with illness or death, loss, that kind of thing. Oh, I don't think this foundation's the right colour for me. Oops. Anyway, the three sort of main factors that attribute to this reputation of bad omen, illness, loss, that kind of thing, is the raven's black plumage, black feathers, again, similar to the black cat, the call that it makes, that like crowing sound, and probably the most relevant is the fact that its diet consists of carrion. It's a carrion bird, and if you don't know what carrion is, it is essentially the decaying flesh of dead animals, so things like roadkill, that kind of thing. Ravens are generally, they're referred to as scavenger birds, quite similar to things like vultures, but prettier. Because I know there's another like bird of prey that just straight up eats bones. Like the stomach acid that it has is powerful enough that it can fully digest bones. I can't remember what bird it is. If you know what it is, please let me know. So I mean, if you imagine, say during like the Middle Ages, the height of like the Black Plague, the Black Death, or even older than that, when the mortality rate for basically everything was significantly higher, they would be absolutely terrified of a bird that came along eating the bodies of the dead. And you have to remember as well that ravens are huge. They are always so much bigger than I think a lot of people realise. So that sort of imagery of like this huge black bird feeding off carcasses during a time when basically little to nothing was really known or understood about them, and most other animals to be fair, it's kind of not overly surprising that they gained this reputation and association with illness and death and just general badness. God, this foundation really is not the right colour for me. Okay, I've just added like a buttload of really pale concealer, which seems to have kind of fixed it a bit. Now, beyond this sort of fear-mongered association with death and illness, ravens in quite a lot of different mythologies have a very strong association with like prophecy and insight as well, and this is in relation to their level of intelligence, particularly the fact that they're considered like talking birds. Anyone who has watched footage of Loki will be able to attest to that, because ravens are phenomenally intelligent. Now, if you combine this idea of like prophecy and insight with the association of death and loss, in a lot of stories from mythology, ravens acted as something known as psychopomps, I believe, which is basically a word that encompasses the idea of a spirit that helps to guide and sort of escort the newly deceased souls from Earth to the afterlife. And I mean, I found references to ravens within mythology from all over the world, including, obviously, ancient Greece, but also Hebrew and Jewish mythology, Norse mythology, Welsh, Irish, English, Native American, and Far Eastern Russia. Which brings me on to the actual topic of this week's episode. Now, the story and character of Kutkh is most widely known among people who share a common, Chukotko-Kamchatkan language, which is basically like a language family within extreme northeastern, like Siberia. And it's traditionally spoken by indigenous hunter-gatherers and like reindeer herders of that area. Now, there is a lot of regional variation on the name, both spelling and pronunciation-wise, and I'll be honest, I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce some of these variations because I have no idea where to even start. So apologies to those of you who are listening on Spotify, because there is a list on screen. Now, generally speaking, Kutkh appears as one of the key figures in creation mythology, as well as being considered a kind of fertile ancestor of mankind, but he also appears as like a mighty shaman and a trickster god. Okay, that is so uneven, but we're gonna roll with it. Kutkh is a very popular subject within the animist stories and beliefs of the Chukchi people, And animist beliefs is basically the belief that all objects, places, creatures, that everything basically possesses a distinct spiritual essence. And it basically perceives all things as being animated and having agency and free will. Hang on, I need to try and get this line work. I don't know why I always seem to think that I can do line work on camera whilst talking, because I absolutely cannot. But going back to Kutkh, whoa, that is very pigmented. So as well as being a popular subject in the stories of the Chukchi people, he also plays quite a central part in the mythology of the Koyaks and the Itelmens of Kamchatka, which are two indigenous groups of that area. Again, apologies if I got the pronunciation on that wrong, please feel free to correct me. And interestingly enough, a lot of the stories that involve Kutkh are actually quite similar to the stories of the Raven within Native American mythology, particularly those in the Pacific Northwest coast, which a lot of people believe is evidence of like a long history of indirect cultural sort of contact between Asian and North American people, which actually makes a lot of sense, because if you look at a map, the closest point between Russia and the Pacific Northwest, in particular like Alaska, is known as the Bering Strait, and it's only like 53 miles across. Because with the way that maps are laid out, we so often see like America and like Russia and Asia being on like the opposite sides of the map, but I always forget that it like curls round and meets on the other side. So they're actually not that far apart. Therefore, it does make sense that there is a bit of a kind of cultural crossover, or at least similarities in culture, between Far East Asia and Northwest America. Now, as I've discovered with almost every myth that I've looked into, the tales of Kutkh come in many different variations, with a lot of them actually kind of contradicting each other. Now, these differences and variations are usually regional, where sort of individual beliefs and folklore have adapted the story through its retelling through generations, and there's a really interesting number of tales that involve Kutkh involving like the creation of the earth, because creation stories, creation beliefs is like its whole own category of things, and it's possibly some of my favourite types of mythology, because I love thinking of like all these different ideas about how the earth came to be. Now, in some tales that I found, earth was made by the creator. However, the earth was surrounded by stone, and the creator then creates the raven Kutkh, who chips away at the stone in order to let the dawn shine onto the earth. Or I guess dawn onto the earth? Other tales contradict that, in that Kutkh actually created himself, in some instances out of like an old fur coat, but he then takes pride in his independence from the creator. There are some regional tales from the Koyak peoples in particular that suggest the area of Kamchatka was created when Kutkh was flying overhead and dropped a feather over the earth, which then fell into the sea and gave rise to the land. After dropping this feather and creating this area, Kutkh then created the first humans. However, he only created one woman, and basically all of the men that he created were completely captivated by her and sort of vowed and competed for her attention and affection. And it was then believed that as these men began to pass away, their love for this first woman endured, and it then transformed into the towering like peaks and volcanoes that litter the Kamchatka landscape. Now, speaking of the mountain peaks all over Kamchatka, there is an alternative origin story, particularly for the pumice formations along the Ozernaya River, because legend has it that after a day of fishing in the river, Kutkh left his fishing boats on the riverbank, where they were then transformed into the cliffs that stand there today. Interestingly enough, these particular mountains and like cliff formations hold quite a deep, very spiritual significance among the native people of Kamchatka, and they're actually revered as being incredibly sacred grounds, to the point that they are deemed like completely off limits to both locals and tourists alike. Now, there are other somewhat less poetic versions where the islands and the continents of the area were actually created from Kutkh's poop, with the rivers and the lakes being made of his waters. And some of the symbolism that went alongside that was that the difficult, like, volcanic terrain and really fast-flowing rivers of Kamchatka were thought to, like, reflect Kutk's unpredictable and stubborn nature. Now, whilst there are all these different variations that I've mentioned, that original idea of Kutkh like chipping away at the stones to allow the dawn onto the earth is quite a common theme among a lot of these different tales. The idea of the raven being the bringer of light to the earth, either in the form of the sun or the moon. There are some tales that tell of an evil spirit that captured these celestial beings and bodies of the sun and the moon, and Kutkh then tricks this spirit into releasing them, which is a tale that again has quite a lot of parallels to legends from various indigenous tribes in the Pacific Northwest. But then on the flip side of that, there are other tales where it's actually Kutkh himself who has captured these celestial beings, and he holds them in his bill, and it is then Kutkh who must be tricked into releasing them. But either way, the theme is still there of Kutkh being involved with the bringing of light to the earth. There are other tales as well that relate to Kutk's involvement in the creation of man, with a specific emphasis on his, virility. And there are many legends of his, descendants and children laying with these other, animal spirits, which then create the people that populate the earth. Now, speaking of other animals, and going back to the tales of, the animistic traditions of North Eurasian people, there are many tales in which Kutkh has different types of interactions and altercations with a number of different animals. And these interactions usually involved some sort of trickery by Kutkh, the results of which were about 50-50 as to whether he would come out on top or whether it would just completely backfire on him. And I mean, we're talking wolves, foxes, bears, wolverines, mouse, owls, dogs, even seals and walruses, which seems a bit insane when you think about the size of these animals in comparison to a raven. I know I said ravens are big in the world of birds, but you think of a raven next to a bear, and a lot of those animals in particular are predatory animals. However, if you know anything about ravens in real life, they are extremely intelligent, and they have been observed engaging with other animals, both in a teasing kind of playful way, but also legitimately tricking these other animals, usually in order to gain some kind of advantage, be it food or something like that. But there have been cases where it's been observed that ravens will tease and play tricks on other animals purely for fun. It reminds me of the fact that you hear about dolphins who use the toxins from pufferfish to basically get high. There was another belief that I found reference to that, whilst is not specifically related to creation, I just had to include it, which is the belief that earthquakes, which are I think quite common in that area due to the volcanic activity and the landscape, it's believed that they were caused by Kutk's sled dogs vigorously shaking their fur, when a dog's all wet or covered in snow. It was believed that it was his dogs shaking that off that then caused earthquakes. I don't know why, I absolutely adored that visual. I think because I often associate dogs as being kind of dopey in that moment when they're doing the fur shake. I think possibly my favourite legend of creation involving Kutkh is from the Kutkh legend, Kutkh and the Mice. So according to this legend, Kutkh, the great and mighty raven, was just flying through the cosmos. However, he grew tired of having to constantly fly. So he regurgitated the earth from his gut, turned himself into a little old man, and then flew down to the empty lands in order to rest. Now, the regurgitation thing is a really interesting concept because obviously that is how most birds feed their young, including ravens. Now, after he transformed himself into the old man and flown down to the earth, he then proceeded to rest for days on end. But as the days passed and the sun began to warm up the earth, the first footsteps that he'd left behind on the land slowly began to change and became the first mice. Now, these mice were curious, they were playful, and they were very excited about having all this big open space to run around and explore. And the mice then began spending their days trying to catch the clouds and the shapes that they could see within the clouds. However, in order to try and reach said clouds, they had to start climbing. But one day, they fell, and they subsequently landed on Kutkh, who was still asleep, so they then decided to seek refuge by climbing up his nose. Now, I don't know what size Kutkh was as this old man, like, in comparison to the mice, to work out sort of how horrified I should be by that mental image, but they climbed up his nose, which then caused him to sneeze. And this sneeze was so, like, powerful and ferocious and full of fury that it caused the earth to buckle, which then created these mountain peaks and valleys. After this big giant sneeze, Kutkh then began trying to chase the mice, and he ended up like going around in circles and forming the wind in order to try and blow them off the earth. He attempted to like step on them and stamp on the mice, which just led to the formation of the oceans and the waters, because obviously where he was stepping was creating basically big holes that then began to fill. So Kutkh then transformed himself into snow in an attempt to basically try and smother the mice, but the mice simply continued to play and ended up like burrowing holes into his like snow skin. As a result, Kutkh then tried to turn himself into fire in order to burn them. However, the fire that he tried to throw to burn these mice ended up burning the snow skin that he had left behind, which ended up leading to this huge battle between snow and fire, which eventually led to the formation of the 4 seasons. And then sort of gradually the Earth as we recognise it today was formed through Kutk's interactions with these small but very numerous mice. During my research into this story in particular, I actually came across a short Russian animation of this legend from like 1985, I think, and it was weirdly like endearing to watch. I don't know how like accurate it is to the actual beliefs of the Kutkh people where the legend comes from, but it included a few other like interesting details from my original research. One of which was that after chasing the mice around the earth and creating the wind, and actually then using the mountains that had formed after his sneeze to try and like squash the mice, Kutkh finally settled down, believing that he had in fact got rid of them. However, in the struggle between Kutkh and these mice, everything had fallen out of the sky and lay like jumbled up and mixed up on the ground. And I mean, we're talking the moon, the sun, stars, clouds, everything, just all in a big mess on the floor. So Kutkh then spends forever trying to put everything back where it should go, but anytime he places something in the wrong place, it would just then fall back out of the sky onto the floor again. This animation also showed that the battle between the snow and the fire was actually what led to the formation of water, which, I mean, makes sense. But these waters and these oceans did eventually drown the mice, but from that grew the first plants. But these weren't like normal plants, because from them sprouted more mice and so on and so forth as the cycle continued. I don't know if this animation was made as like an educational thing or whether it was designed for children, because the style of the animation and like the way that it tells this story is kind of, it reminded me a lot of like old school Tom and Jerry, kind of mixed in with a bit of like Wile E. Coyote, in that Kutkh kept coming up with these like increasingly elaborate, very destructive, over the top ways to try and get rid of these mice, but each time the mice just found a way to like best him and play with whatever it was that he'd created. I'll leave a link to it in the description so you can have a watch if you wanted to. If anyone knows any more about this animation or the context of it, please let me know. Now, despite all these various tales of Kutkh being involved in like the literal creation of the earth, mankind, and his gifts of light, fire, language, fresh water, not to mention him apparently giving mankind the skill of copulation, not all attitudes towards him are particularly admirable, or in some cases even grateful. As often as he is portrayed as this deity level creator, usually by like the Koryak people, He is equally as often depicted as more a laughingstock, particularly within the Eitelman people. And those tales are a lot more similar to traditional tales about like trickster gods, again, such as the coyote within Native American mythology. In these cases, he is seen more akin to like a scavenger. He's seen as hungry, thieving, selfish, and there was a Russian explorer from like the 1700s who commented on the relationship between certain indigenous groups, the Eitelmans in particular, and this mighty raven. And he stated, "They pay no homage to him and never ask a favour of him. They speak of him only in derision. They tell such indecent stories about him that I would be embarrassed to repeat them. They scold him for having made too many mountains, precipices, reefs, sandbanks, and swift rivers, for causing rainstorms and tempests which frequently inconvenience them. In winter, when they climb up or down mountains, they heap abuses on him and curse him with imprecations. They behave the same way when they are in other difficult or dangerous situations." It's very interesting to me how many different mythology stories I come across where a particular creature, person, being ends up being blamed for any kind of like misfortune that happens to people. It's almost like the superstition kind of thing. You know, if you break a mirror, you'll have bad luck for 7 years, so it gives people something to blame. But I found it through the legend of Stingy Jack at Halloween. Pandora, again, is blamed for like the evils of the world and the evils of mankind. During the witch hunt trials, again, creatures like black cats were often blamed for a lot of things that went wrong. Haunted dolls, it's such a common occurrence for people to find something, an idea, a creature, a person, and kind of latch onto it being this is the reason why bad things are happening to us. Now, going back to the Eitelman people again, whilst not being particularly fond of Kutkh, their belief surrounding him actually extended a bit further than that, in that they believed he had a wife, a significantly more intelligent woman named Chashi, who was described as having like outstanding intellectual insight, but being of average physical appearance. It was believed that when the world was young, the couple would meet every year at many of the great rivers of that area, where they would then bear a son and a daughter at each river. And it was these pairings that the Eitelman people would trace their like genealogical origins. And then because each river started with its own unique sort of first parents, it explained where all of the different like dialects came from within that area. Now, despite all of the contradictions within both the stories and the general sort of attitude towards Kutkh, his image remains quite popular and is considered fairly iconic within Kamchatka, and even to this day it's very often used within like adverts and promotional materials. I don't know if that's in like a similar way that West Virginia uses Mothman as kind of like a cultural symbol almost, but apparently quite a common like souvenir from the area are like stylized carvings of Kutkh done by Koryak artisans, and they're often embellished with like beads and sort of lined with furs. If anyone is from that area or has ever been to that area, please let me know if you saw any of this kind of stuff. I'd love to know what it's like. Okay, this is another case of trust the process because I'm really hoping the final details pull it all together. Now, as I stated at the very beginning of the video, there are tales of ravens from mythology all over the world, both as a symbolic sense, but also as like individual characters, such as Kutkh. In ancient Greece, the raven was associated with the god Apollo, the god of like prophecy, though they were generally actually considered a symbol of bad luck, but they also acted as God's messengers to the mortal world. And there's one tale that I found where Apollo sends a white raven to spy on his like lover, and the raven discovers her laying with another man. Then, when the raven goes back to deliver this news to Apollo, in his fury, he scorches the raven and turns its feathers black. The raven is actually the very first species of bird that is mentioned within the Hebrew Bible, and it is mentioned like numerous times after that as well. In particular, in the tale of Noah and the flood, Noah sends out a raven in order to try and determine whether the floods have stopped and the water has started to recede or not. And when the raven doesn't return, it's signalled that the waters had receded because the raven had stayed to feed on the corpses of the drowned. Within Norse mythology, 2 ravens are associated with Odin, serving as his eyes and ears, or representative of his thoughts and memories. They are named, bear with me, Hugin and Munin, I think. And again, they acted as messengers, flying out each day to bring news of Midgard to Odin. Irish mythology often associated ravens with warfare and battlefields through the figures of Bav, which is also sometimes translated as crow, who was a war goddess who took the form of a crow or a raven and would cause fear and confusion among the soldiers on the battlefield in order to turn the tide of the battle. As well as Bav was the goddess Morrigan, but in some cases I found actually that they were considered like one in the same person, in that Morrigan would transform into Bav during the battle. Ravens are particularly prominent in Welsh mythology as well, and I found a poem from like the Middle Ages that associated the raven with bravery as well as battle and death, and they dubbed the battlefield as the Raven's Feast, which, to be fair, does check out. In something called the Mabinogion, which is a collection of Welsh tales compiled in like the 12th and 13th centuries, 2 of the most well-known characters from it, Bran the Blessed and his sister Branwen, both of their names derived from the Welsh word for raven. And interestingly, according to like later texts, following Bran's death, he commanded his men to cut off his head and carry it to the White Mount in London and bury it there. The White Mount often being associated with Tower Hill and the Tower of London. Now, I have a really interesting side note about the Tower of London, but I have some more line work to do on this side, and then I'm basically done. So let me go finish off the look, do the finishing touches, and then we can be back to close up. Okay, we're just going to have to pretend that this wig is like properly raven jet black coloured, because I realise I actually don't have like just a pure black haired wig. I'm happy with like certain elements of this look. There's something throwing me off about it, and I think it's this bit with the ravens and the eyes. It just came out a little bit clunky, I think is probably the best word I can think to describe it. I actually took a little bit of inspiration from like the front cover of the Raising Loki book with the colours, the purples, the blues, which is what I was trying to kind of capture with this coloration, I guess. Obviously Raven colours is this insanely deep, kind of bluey black colour, but then I just wanted to add the kind of purple element to it as well. I don't know if it works. I'm really happy with the forehead piece, but I don't know if it ties together how I thought it would. I had mentioned the Tower of London, which we're circling back to because this Celtic legend of Bran and the Tower may actually be the origin as to why, to this day, ravens are kept at the Tower of London. Now, according to English legend, if the ravens of the Tower of London are removed, the Kingdom of England would fall. As a result of this, it's believed that there has always been at least 6 ravens in residence for centuries. Charles II allegedly ordered for the ravens at the tower to be removed in like the 1600s due to complaints from the royal astronomer. However, when Charles then learned of this legend, he refused to have the ravens removed and instead just relocated the astronomer's observatory. So, ravens have historically always been at the Tower of London, apart from the Second World War, during which most of the ravens within the tower unfortunately died from shock due to like the bombing raids, and it left behind a single mated pair known as Mabel and Grip. However, shortly before the tower reopened to the public, Mabel just flew away, and this left Grip absolutely devastated, and just a few weeks after this, he flew away as well, and it's believed that he flew off in search for his mate. Now, this instance with the ravens leaving the Tower of London was reported in several newspapers at the time, and some of these stories contained the first printed references to this legend about the British Empire or kingdom falling if the ravens were removed. Considering that the British Empire was in fact dismantled not long after this, It confirmed this legend to quite a lot of people, and great care was then taken to ensure that a new set of ravens were in residence at the tower before it reopened in 1946. And again, to this day, there are ravens in residence there. I know the ravens of the Tower of London have become kind of their own tourist attraction a bit, but I'd never heard of that legend before, and I kind of love it. I'd known ravens were kind of similar to black cats in like the world of superstition, i.e. being bad luck or just associated with sort of negative things. But I had no idea the extent of like some of the mythology that surrounded them, especially not in the case of like a raven spirit being behind the creation of the earth. That was really, really fascinating to look into. As I mentioned, there are quite a few other myths involving ravens in spirit or just as an animal. If you want me to have a look a bit deeper into any of those other myths, let me know in the comments down below. Now, obviously our understanding of ravens, corvids, birds like this in general is a lot better now. We understand that they are intelligent and sort of almost relatable animals. They develop trust, they recognize people, and a lot of the general like negative associations with them are slowly starting to disappear as we understand more. And I think more often than not now, birds like ravens are more often like revered, or at the very least respected, rather than like feared. Again, it's something that's quite prominent in Elliot's book about Loki, and especially through a lot of the social media that he does, in that he's trying to share, obviously, Loki's story and kind of share with the world just how incredible these birds actually are. Like, they're so intelligent, it is unreal. Obviously, ravens and crows are quite synonymous with, like, the alternative scene, particularly, like, Gothic imagery. Think of like Edgar Allan Poe, a lot of classic Gothic literature, things like that. Crows are very prominent. Again, also with the association because they were often seen sort of hanging around cemeteries and graveyards. I think I've mentioned in a previous video, we have quite a big family of like corvids that live near our house. We don't have any ravens, but it's a lot of like rooks, jackdaws. I've seen a couple of crows as well, but they are honestly some of my favourite animals. They're so I love them. But so brings us to the end of my little raven tale. Let me know what you guys think of ravens in general, to be honest. These myths in particular. What sort of superstitions or stories do you guys know about these birds? Let me know what you think of the look as well. I still can't make my mind up on it. As always, if there are any other stories, legends, creatures that you want me to look into, leave a comment down below. I do read through all of them and I keep a little note of what people want me to look into. Don't forget to follow me on all other social media channels, Instagram, TikTok, Spotify, and all the rest of them. But other than that, I hope you all have a fabulous day. I love and appreciate all of you very, very much. And I will see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.